Everyone in the diner froze when a bully angrily slapped an elderly veteran across the face and shouted at him, "Shut up!" He thought he had humiliated the old man in front of everyone, but just a few seconds later the door opened, and his granddaughter, world champion Ronda Rousey, walked in. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The smell of black coffee hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of bacon and toast that drifted out from the small kitchen at the back of the cafe. Outside, the street was quiet, the town still waking up, and the golden light of early morning filtered through the wide front windows. The cafe had been here longer than most of the residents could remember, with its creaking wooden floorboards, its cracked leather booths, and its walls decorated with faded photographs of the town in earlier days. To some, it was just another diner. To others, it was the heart of the community. To Ronald Rousey, it was a place where he could still sit with dignity, unseen and unbothered, drinking his coffee the way he liked it, black, strong, with no sugar, no cream. Ronald sat at his usual table, the one near the window, where he could see both the entrance and the street outside. It was habit more than preference, old instincts from another life. Another time, the posture of a soldier never left you, not even when the war had ended decades ago. His jacket, pressed as neatly as his hands could manage, bore the pin of his service. It was small, barely noticeable to anyone not looking for it, but to him, it carried more weight than the medal it represented. It was proof of what he had endured, of what he had given, and of what he had survived. His hair had thinned, his body was no longer the unyielding machine of his youth, but his back was still straight, his shoulders squared, and his eyes retained the sharp clarity of a man who had once been trained to notice every detail, every movement, every sign of danger. He raised the cup of coffee to his lips, savoring the heat as it spread through him. Across from him, two of his old friends from the Veterans Hall sat together, men he had known for years, their conversations meandering through politics, the economy, and their memories of a world that seemed more distant with each passing day. One of them chuckled as he read from the morning paper about a new mayoral initiative. "They call it progress," he muttered, "but it's nothing more than selling pieces of this town to the highest bidder." Ronald listened, nodding slowly, but his words, when he chose to speak, carried the weight of something more. "Progress comes whether we want it or not," he said evenly. "The measure of a community isn't how it changes, but how it keeps its honor when it does. Men can lose everything and still hold on to that." His voice, though softened by age, still bore the authority of someone who had once given orders in the field, someone who had carried the lives of others in his hands. The other veterans fell silent for a moment, reflecting, then smiled faintly. They had all heard Ronald speak like this before. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. Even now, decades after he had retired, people could feel that sense of command radiating from him. The door creaked open, the bell above it giving a half-hearted jingle. Conversations tapered off slightly as new footsteps echoed against the floor. 3 men entered. At their center was a tall, broad man with the kind of presence that was impossible to ignore. His hair was short, his jaw square, his face hardened by years of labor and hardened further by arrogance. He wore work clothes that suggested a man of the construction trade, but the expensive watch glittering on his wrist betrayed something more. Something showy, something that did not belong to a simple laborer. This was Clyde Harper, and everyone in the cafe knew him. His reputation stretched further than his reach should have, and the shadow he cast over the town seemed longer than any man's should be. Behind him came 2 younger men, heavy-set, carrying themselves with the swagger of those who had chosen the safety of following a stronger man's lead, rather than forging their own. They were his satellites, orbiting him, feeding off his authority and enforcing it when needed. Ronald's gaze lifted briefly. His eyes met Clyde's for an instant, then returned calmly to his coffee. It wasn't defiance, nor was it submission. It was simply the look of a man who had no reason to fear another, not even someone half his age and twice his size. Clyde, however, did not see it that way. To him, any man who did not lower his eyes was a man challenging him, a man daring to stand equal. The veterans at the other table shifted uncomfortably, whispering between themselves. One of them said, Leave it be, Ron. Don't give him a reason. Ronald did not answer. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. Clyde sauntered to the counter, his boots heavy against the old wooden floor. He greeted the waitress with a mock sweetness that made her lips tighten and ordered his coffee in a voice loud enough to carry across the cafe. Then turning, he leaned his elbows against the counter, scanning the room. His eyes settled on Ronald again, and a thin smile stretched across his face. He tapped the counter with one finger. "Look at this," he said, his voice pitched so everyone could hear. "Still clinging to old war stories, aren't you? Sitting here like some kind of general, holding court in a diner." His two companions chuckled dutifully, their eyes following Clyde's gaze to the old man by the window. The room quieted. Conversation stilled. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Everyone knew the pattern. Clyde Harper was about to make someone his target, and once he began, it would not stop until he was satisfied. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some lowering their eyes, others pretending to be absorbed in their food. No one wanted to be caught in the storm. Ronald lifted his cup again, his hand steady despite the weight of the silence. He took a measured sip, set the cup back down, and met Clyde's gaze without a flicker of hesitation. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, only the calm acknowledgement of a man who had stood in front of worse storms and survived them. The waitress, Maria, lingered nearby, her lips pressed tightly together. She had seen this before. Clyde enjoyed these displays of power, and no one ever stood against him. No one dared, yet something about the way Ronald carried himself now made her heart beat faster, though she could not say why. Outside the cafe, the town went on as usual. People walked to work. Cars rolled slowly down the street. The morning unfolded as it always did, but inside, within these walls, a tension was building, thickening, something inevitable pushing closer with every word, every glance. Clyde's smile widened, but it was the smile of a predator who had just spotted prey, and the prey he thought he saw was an old man with nothing left but memories. Ronald's fingers brushed against the small notebook on the table beside him. He didn't open it, didn't write anything. He just rested his hand there, steady, calm, as though reminding himself of the order in his world. In that stillness, something powerful lingered, invisible but undeniable. And so the morning that had begun like any other was shifting, taking on a new shape. The quiet cafe was about to become the stage for something larger than anyone in that room could have anticipated. Ronald did not know it. The veterans did not know it. Not even Maria with her worried eyes knew it. But the storm that Clyde Harper carried with him would soon break, and the echoes of it would spread far beyond the old wooden walls of that little diner. The veteran straightened his back once more, took another sip of coffee, and waited. The moment Ronald set his cup back down on the saucer, the weight of the cafe seemed to shift. Clyde Harper had not taken his eyes off him since he'd walked through the door. The silence of the room was thick, punctuated only by the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional clink of cutlery against porcelain. To anyone watching, it was obvious that Clyde had chosen his target, and everyone else had silently chosen to disappear into the background. He pushed himself off the counter with deliberate slowness, carrying his coffee in one hand, though it was clear the cup was nothing more than a prop. His boots struck the floorboards with a measured rhythm, each step heavier than the last, each one announcing his approach to the man by the window. His companions followed a pace behind, their expressions mocking, their eyes glinting with the smug confidence of men who knew their side was the stronger one. Ronald remained seated, his back straight, his gaze steady. He watched Clyde approach without so much as a flinch, his face unreadable, the faint lines of age deepening as his jaw set in quiet resolve. He had faced storms before, storms far greater than this one, though perhaps not storms quite so brazen in their cruelty. This was not a battlefield, but in its own way it was, and he knew enough to recognize the signs of a fight before the first blow landed. Clyde stopped just short of Ronald's table, looming above him. He looked down at the old man with a sneer that twisted his mouth into something ugly. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the light as he set the cup down with a loud clatter on Ronald's table, sending a thin line of hot coffee spilling across the surface. You sit here every morning like you own the place, Clyde said, his voice booming loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. Like this town still owes you something. But this isn't your world anymore, old man. This is mine. The words lingered in the air, sharp and cruel. Some of the patrons shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene. The veterans at the next table tightened their hands into fists, but their eyes dropped quickly. They had families, lives, responsibilities that could be crushed easily if they stood in the way of a man like Clyde Harper. The mayor looked the other way, the sheriff kept her distance, and most of the townsfolk knew better than to cross him. Ronald's voice came steady, calm, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. I fought in wars so that men like you could live free, even if you've forgotten what freedom costs. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the room. A murmur rose from one corner, someone gasping quietly, but it was drowned out by the sudden shift in Clyde's expression. The mocking smile faltered, replaced by something darker. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and the hand resting on the table curled into a fist. You don't speak to me like that, Clyde hissed. And before anyone could move, his hand lashed out. The crack of the slap echoed like a gunshot. Ronald's head snapped to the side, the sharp sting of flesh against flesh searing his cheek. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. The sound of a cup dropping, shattering against the floor, punctuated the silence that followed. For an instant, time seemed to hold its breath. Ronald did not stumble. He steadied himself, fingers brushing against the table's edge. His cheek burned, but his eyes did not lower. He turned his head back, meeting Clyde's glare with the calm endurance of a man who had known pain far greater than this, and survived. That defiance only enraged Clyde further. With a sudden, brutal movement, he seized Ronald by the front of his jacket, dragging him halfway out of his chair. He pressed a large, calloused hand over Ronald's mouth, leaning close enough for the old man to feel his breath hot against his face. "Shut up!" Clyde bellowed. "You hear me? Not another word!" The room froze. A woman near the back raised her phone higher, her hands trembling as she recorded. Another patron's spoon clinked against a saucer as it slipped from his hand. Forgotten. The veterans at the other table half rose, but the weight of fear pressed them back down. Even Maria, the waitress, stood paralyzed behind the counter, her eyes wide with horror, her phone already recording, though her lips trembled too much to speak. Ronald's chest rose and fell beneath Clyde's grip, but his eyes remained steady. Behind the force holding him down, behind the hands silencing him, there was no fear. Only a deep, burning disappointment. He had seen bullies before, had fought men who took what they wanted with violence, who sought power in the humiliation of others. This man was no different, no more than a shadow of every coward who had ever mistaken cruelty for strength. Clyde shoved him back into the chair, the old wooden frame groaning under the sudden weight. Ronald steadied himself with both hands on the table, his fingers brushing against the spilled coffee, now cold and sticky against his skin. His voice, when it came, was muffled but firm. "You think strength is in striking the weak," Ronald said evenly, "but real strength is in restraint." The words only fanned the flames of Clyde's anger. He grabbed the old man again, his knuckles white with pressure, his breath ragged with fury. "Don't lecture me, old man. You don't belong here. You and your medals, your stories, they mean nothing in this town now." Ronald tried to rise, but Clyde shoved him back down hard, the chair scraping across the floor. Gasps rose from around the room as people realized the escalation, as the scene shifted from humiliation to violence. Clyde's men moved closer, their grins fading slightly as the tension thickened. They weren't used to seeing resistance from anyone in this town, but Ronald was not the kind of man to bow. His silence now, his refusal to cry out, only made Clyde angrier. "You'll apologize," Clyde growled. "Right here, right now. Apologize for disrespecting me." Ronald looked him in the eye, his jaw set. His voice calm despite the hand that had struck him, the grip that held him. "I apologize only when I've done wrong," he said, "and I've done nothing wrong." The refusal landed heavier than any blow could have. Clyde's face reddened, his lips curling into a snarl. Then with a sudden, explosive motion, his hand swung again. The second slap cracked louder than the first, sending Ronald's head to the side, his cheek splitting where a heavy ring caught the skin. A thin line of blood trickled down. The cafe gasped in unison, some crying out in horror, others whispering to one another in shock. Phones captured every angle. Security cameras blinked silently from above, and the weight of what had just happened hung over everyone like a storm ready to break. Ronald's fingers went to his cheek, touching the warmth of blood. He straightened again, his body trembling not with fear, but with the effort of keeping his composure. His eyes locked on Clyde's, steady, unyielding, and he spoke, his voice low but caring. "You've just made a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." Clyde laughed, throwing his head back, the sound raw and cruel. He turned to his men, who forced chuckles of their own, though unease flickered in their eyes. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa?" Clyde taunted. "You think your words mean something here? You're nothing but an old man clinging to the past." The veterans at the nearby table stood now, their faces pale, their fists clenched, but still they hesitated. Maria's voice finally broke through, trembling but loud enough to be heard. "Stop it, Clyde. He's done nothing to you." "Shut up, Maria," Clyde snapped, pointing a finger at her without turning his glare away from Ronald. "You want to keep your job? You'll keep your mouth shut." The threat silenced her, but her phone stayed raised, her recording steady despite her shaking hands. Ronald, still seated, still composed despite the blood on his cheek, looked at the man towering over him. His silence now was not surrender, but something else entirely, something that carried more weight than violence ever could. And yet Clyde, drunk on the thrill of dominance, did not see it. He saw only an old man defying him, and in that defiance he saw a challenge he could not ignore. The cafe, caught between fear and awe, held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. No one yet realized that the moment of reckoning was closer than any of them imagined, that the door of the cafe would soon open again, and everything would change. The sting of the second slap still lingered in the air, reverberating through the silence of the cafe, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the violence. Ronald's cheek was red, split open slightly by the ring that Clyde wore so proudly, a mocking ornament that now carried the weight of cruelty. The veterans nearby had risen partway from their seats but faltered again, the shadow of Clyde's influence holding them back. Maria's phone continued to record, her knuckles white as she clutched it, her lips pressed tightly shut, knowing that if she spoke again, she might pay for it with her job, or worse. Every soul in that room could feel the gravity of what had just happened. Clyde Harper had gone further than usual, taken his performance of dominance to a point from which there would be no easy return. But still he loomed, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his brow as he glared down at Ronald, waiting for the apology that would never come. It was in that suffocating silence that the cafe door swung open. The bell above it gave its usual half-hearted jingle, but this time the sound cut through the room like the crack of a whip. Heads turned instinctively toward the entrance. The light of the morning spilled in behind the figure standing in the doorway, casting her silhouette in stark relief before she stepped inside. Ronda Rousey entered without hesitation, her stride purposeful, her presence commanding the attention of everyone before she had even spoken a word. Ronald's eyes shifted to her, a flicker of surprise cutting through his stoic composure. He had not expected to see her here, not now, not in this moment of humiliation. And yet as she walked toward him, shoulders squared, gaze locked on the scene before her, he felt something stir inside him, pride fierce and unyielding, mixed with a faint, almost paternal worry. He had raised her differently, taught her to carry herself with strength, but to see her step into his defense now was both vindication and risk. Clyde's expression changed as he saw her. For a moment he blinked, as though uncertain what to make of the woman striding toward him with such unwavering determination. Then he smirked, laughter bubbling up like bile. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice filling the cafe. "The old man's got a guard dog. What is this, Grandpa? You bring your little girl to fight your battles?" His two companions chuckled, though their laughter rang hollow, more an echo of Clyde's bravado than genuine amusement. Rhonda stopped a few feet away, her eyes sweeping over the scene. Her grandfather bruised but unbroken, the spilled coffee across the table. Clyde's hulking frame standing over him like some petty tyrant relishing his moment of power. Her fists tightened at her sides, but her face betrayed no fear, no hesitation. She spoke with a calmness that belied the storm rising within her. "Step away from him," she said simply, her voice low but caring. The smirk widened on Clyde's face. He turned slightly toward his men, shaking his head as though amused by the audacity. "Listen to her. Step away," she says, like she's got any say in this room. He looked back at Rhonda, his eyes glinting with malice. "Do yourself a favor, sweetheart. Go sit down before you get hurt. This isn't the UFC. This is real life." Ronald stirred in his chair, his voice soft but firm. "Rhonda, you don't have to." But she cut him off with a glance, not out of disrespect, but with the assurance of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. His words fell away as he recognized that look in her eyes. It was the same look he had carried into battle years ago, the look of someone prepared to stand their ground no matter the cost. Clyde laughed again, emboldened by what he perceived as an easy win. "What are you going to do, huh? Break a nail? Scratch my face? You think anyone here is going to step in to save you when I put you on the floor?" He reached for Ronald's jacket again, jerking the old man forward as though to prove his point. "See? He belongs to me now. And if you don't like it, maybe I'll make an example out of you too." Rhonda's movements were deliberate, unhurried. She slipped her jacket from her shoulders and draped it carefully over the back of a nearby chair. Her gaze never leaving Clyde. The cafe was silent except for the pounding of hearts, the anticipation so thick it felt suffocating. Everyone could sense what was coming, though no one dared to predict how quickly the balance of power would shift. Maria's phone trembled in her hands, her recording unwavering as she captured every second. The veterans leaned forward, their eyes wide, the old embers of courage flickering as they saw something in Rhonda that reminded them of their own youth, of battles fought and victories hard won. Even Clyde's men shifted uncomfortably, sensing a tension in the air they did not understand, a storm gathering in the calm of her stance. Rhonda stepped closer, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "Let him go," she said. Clyde sneered, tightening his grip on Ronald's jacket, yanking him upright again. "Or what? You gonna cry? You gonna scream? You think anybody here cares what happens to an old man who doesn't know his place?" He shoved Ronald back down roughly, the chair groaning under the impact. "You don't belong here, old man, and neither does she." The line had been crossed, though Clyde did not realize it. To him, this was still a show of dominance, a spectacle to remind the town who controlled it. But to everyone else watching, the tide had already begun to turn. The sight of Rhonda standing there, unwavering, her grandfather's blood still fresh on his cheek, had altered the balance of the room. What had been a one-sided humiliation was now on the edge of something else entirely. Something none of them could quite name, but all of them felt. Ronald looked up at her again, pride swelling in his chest despite the ache in his bones and the sting of his wounds. He saw not just his granddaughter, but the culmination of everything he had ever hoped the next generation would become: strong, fearless, unwilling to bow before tyranny. Clyde, oblivious to the shifting current, raised his voice for all to hear. "Go on then, little girl. Show us what you got. Let's see if you're half as tough as you pretend to be." He spread his arms wide mockingly, inviting her in. His men laughed again, though their voices wavered slightly, unease creeping in at the edges. Rhonda's lips pressed into a thin line. She did not respond to his taunts. She did not need to. The silence was her answer. Her eyes fixed on him with the calm certainty of someone who had trained her entire life for moments just like this. Every movement of her body, every breath she took, radiated discipline, focus, control. She was not a girl playing at strength. She was a fighter, a warrior, and soon Clyde Harper would understand the difference. The cafe seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in as the weight of expectation pressed down. Outside, the morning sun shone on, unaware of the storm brewing within. Inside, however, the balance of power was about to shift irrevocably, as the predator discovered that the prey he had chosen was not prey at all, but something far more dangerous. And as Ronda Rousey straightened in his chair, blood drying on his cheek, he realized that whatever happened next would not just be about him. It would be about the town, about the people watching, about the line between fear and courage, between cruelty and justice. His granddaughter had come at the very moment he needed her most, and in her presence, he found a strength he thought he had left behind long ago. The silence stretched, taut as wire. Clyde's smirk deepened. Rhonda's stance hardened. The cafe held its breath. The storm was about to break. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. The air in the cafe was suffocating, each second stretched thin with the weight of what was about to happen. Clyde Harper still wore his mocking grin, convinced that the balance of power had not shifted, that the young woman standing before him was just a daughter or a granddaughter, foolish enough to think that her presence could matter in a confrontation like this. He did not know who she was, and even if he had, his pride would not have allowed him to accept that anything about this moment could turn against him. His men stood at his back, their expressions uneasy but still laced with loyalty, waiting for their leader to give the signal. Ronda Rousey's eyes never left him. She had grown up watching her grandfather stand tall, listening to his stories of dignity and endurance, understanding from an early age that strength was not just in the fist, but in the resolve to protect what mattered. Her body was still, her breathing measured, but every fiber of her being was coiled and ready. She did not fidget or posture like a street fighter, did not rely on bravado or words. The silence around her was her armor, and the discipline of years of training lay behind every subtle shift of her stance. Clyde moved first. With a bark of laughter, he lunged forward, his hand reaching to shove Ronald again, to drive the old man back into his chair for one more show of dominance. But this time, the hand never reached its target. In the blink of an eye, Ronda stepped forward, her grip latching onto his wrist with the precision of a lifetime of judo. The motion was fluid, almost graceful, but it carried the inevitability of a storm. With a sharp turn of her hip, she pulled him forward, his own momentum betraying him. The next moment, the cafe floor shook with the thunder of Clyde's body slamming down hard against the wood as she hurled him over her shoulder. The crowd gasped, a collective sound of shock and disbelief. The veterans by the window sat frozen, mouths slightly open, as though they had just witnessed a ghost of their youth. Maria's phone dipped for an instant before she steadied it again, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what she was capturing. Even Ronald, though he had known his granddaughter's skill, had never seen her unleash it in defense of something so personal. His chest swelled with pride, tempered only by worry for what might follow. Clyde groaned on the floor, stunned by the suddenness of it. His arrogance had not prepared him for the reality of a trained fighter, let alone someone like Ronda. His men reacted instinctively, rushing forward to defend their leader's pride. The first lunged at her from the side, arms outstretched to grab her. Without hesitation, Ronda pivoted, sweeping her leg in a sharp arc that caught him at the ankles. His balance vanished, and he collapsed onto his back with a crash that rattled the dishes on nearby tables. The second came in harder, bolder, throwing a heavy punch meant to end the fight before it truly began. Ronda caught his arm mid-swing, twisting it with practiced precision. The man howled in pain as she dropped to the ground, locking her legs around his arm and extending it in a perfect armbar. His screams filled the cafe, echoing off the walls. She could have snapped the joint then and there, but she held back just enough, applying pressure without destruction, controlling the chaos with the restraint her grandfather had spoken of so many times. With a quick shift, she released him, letting him stumble back, clutching his arm and groaning, no longer eager to rejoin the fight. Clyde, shaking the dizziness from his head, pulled himself up on unsteady legs. Fury boiled in his eyes, humiliation burning hotter than any physical pain. He had built his entire life on fear, on intimidation, on the certainty that no one would ever stand against him in this town. But in less than a minute, this young woman had destroyed that illusion, throwing him like a rag doll in front of everyone he ruled over. His pride could not allow it, and with a roar he charged at her, arms wide, intent on driving her into the wall. Ronda's face did not change. She stepped aside, catching his momentum once more. This time she hooked her arm around his neck as he stumbled past her. In one clean motion, she dragged him down to the ground, her weight and leverage pinning him where he fell. her arms locked around his throat, her body a vice that controlled every twitch of his flailing limbs. His breath came short, his face reddened, and he clawed at her grip in desperation. The cafe was utterly silent now except for the gasping of Clyde Harper as his strength betrayed him. He flailed, bucked, tried to throw her off, but every move only tightened her hold. She leaned close, her voice calm, steady, as though she were explaining something to a stubborn child. "This is what real strength looks like," she said softly. "Control, discipline, knowing when to stop." Clyde gurgled, his hands slapping weakly against the floor in submission. Rhonda held him a moment longer, ensuring the lesson was imprinted in his very bones, before she released him and stood. Clyde rolled onto his side, coughing, his pride shattered, his authority broken before the eyes of the town. For several heartbeats, no one spoke. The entire room remained frozen, absorbing what had just happened. Then slowly, the murmurs began. Someone gasped, "Did you see that?" Another whispered, "She threw him like he was nothing." The veterans stood fully now, their faces alight with something long forgotten, a mixture of awe and vindication. Maria's phone continued to record, her hands steady at last as she realized she was capturing a moment no one would forget. Ronald rose carefully from his chair, his cheek still bloodied, but his bearing as straight as ever. He walked to his granddaughter, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. His voice carried not just for her, but for the entire room. "She's my granddaughter, and she has learned that honor isn't in hurting others, it's in protecting them." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling as the weight of fear that had held the cafe for so long began to crack. People clapped, some cheered. Others wept quietly as they realized they had just seen the tyrant of their town undone not by violence for its own sake, but by strength wielded with purpose. Clyde sat on the floor, his chest heaving, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He looked up at Rhonda, his lips trembling with the need to speak, to threaten, to reassert his power. But the words did not come. The sight of her standing there, calm and ready, her grandfather beside her, was enough to silence him. He muttered instead, a pathetic hiss barely audible over the applause. "You'll regret this." Rhonda met his eyes, unflinching. "No," she said, "you will." The words landed heavier than any strike. The truth undeniable. She had not just defeated him, she had dismantled everything he represented. The fear that had once kept this town in his grip was gone, replaced by the undeniable memory of what they had witnessed here. The storm had broken, and with it, everything had changed. The cafe was still trembling with the echo of what had just taken place. For a long moment after Rhonda released Clyde Harper onto the floor, no one dared move. It was as though the entire diner, its old ceiling fans whirring, its scent of bacon and coffee clinging stubbornly to the air, had become a courtroom where the verdict had already been delivered. Clyde sat hunched, gasping, his hand pressed to his neck, as though to reassure himself he still had breath in him. The pride and menace that had filled his eyes only minutes earlier had drained away, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who suddenly realized that he no longer controlled the room. The silence cracked first with the sound of Maria's voice. She had lowered her phone at last, her eyes shining not just with fear, but with a sharp, blazing admiration. "Are you all right, Mr. Rousey?" she asked, stepping forward. Ronald lifted his hand to his cheek where the skin still burned from the slap, the bruise already blooming, but his posture was straight and his expression calm. "I've had worse," he answered quietly. He looked at his granddaughter, and in that look was an entire history, the childhood she had grown through under his roof, the discipline he had instilled, the lessons about standing tall when others tried to bend you. The crowd began to stir, whispers flowing like a current. "That's Ronald Rousey's granddaughter. Did you see the way she threw him? Like he was nothing." Clyde Harper, on the floor, begging. The voices grew, not in fear, but in relief, as though something heavy had been lifted from the air of Millbrook itself. Veterans at the corner table exchanged knowing nods. One of them, an old Marine named Charles, leaned over his cane and muttered, "Damn fine to see a bully fall flat." Clyde tried to rise. He braced his arm against the floor, pushing himself halfway up, but the weight of humiliation seemed heavier than his own body. The room was no longer his. Where once his glare had silenced dissent, now even the teenagers in the back booth held their phones high, openly recording, no longer afraid. His men, those who hadn't been left groaning on the floor by Ronda's swift moves, hovered near the door uncertainly, torn between loyalty and survival. "You'll regret this," Clyde rasped, his voice weak but still laced with venom. Ronda stepped closer, not to strike, not to threaten, but simply to look him in the eye. Her voice carried enough calm authority that it stilled every whisper. "No, Clyde," she said evenly. "You've already lost." The words cut deeper than any chokehold, and he knew it. His lips trembled with rage, but he had nothing to answer. He stumbled toward the door, his men rushing to help him, though their eyes betrayed their doubt. When he pushed out into the sunlight, the crowd of townspeople who had gathered outside parted, their faces not fearful but disdainful. For the first time in years, Clyde Harper left a room without the satisfaction of dominance. Inside, the atmosphere shifted into something electric. Applause broke out, not the polite clapping of an audience, but the raw, spontaneous applause of people who had witnessed a moment of truth. Maria joined in, her smile radiant, and the veterans followed, some even standing straighter as though remembering what it felt like to see justice enacted before their eyes. Ronald placed a steady hand on Ronda's shoulder. He didn't need to say much, but when he did, his words filled the room. "This is what honor looks like. Not fear, not cruelty, but standing for what is right, no matter the cost." Phones buzzed all around. Videos were already being uploaded. Within minutes, the incident would spread across the internet like wildfire. A local bully humiliated, a veteran defended, a world champion fighter stepping in for family. Some would watch it for the spectacle, but others would see something more, a reminder of what courage looked like when tested. Maria slipped back behind the counter, her fingers shaking as she refreshed her screen. "It's already live," she whispered, showing the rising view count to a customer. Comments poured in with speed. The video clipped, shared, reposted. "She's a hero. Look at that throw. Who is she?" Another read, "That man hit a veteran unforgivable." Within 10 minutes, hashtags began to appear, mixing Ronda's name with Ronald's, tying their moment together in a story the world seemed hungry to consume. But for Ronald, the glare of sudden attention felt less like triumph and more like a storm on the horizon. He leaned on his cane and guided Ronda toward the booth where he had been sitting. She resisted at first, insisting he take a seat to rest, but he shook his head. "I'm fine," he said with that same steadiness she had always known. Then lowering his voice so only she could hear, he added, "You did right, but this fight isn't over." He was right. Outside in the parking lot, Clyde sat in the passenger seat of his truck, his face flushed and twisted with rage. His men muttered nervously, one of them whispering, "We can't take her." "Did you see what she did?" Clyde's fist slammed the dashboard. "Shut up," he hissed. "This isn't finished. You think I'll be made a fool in my own town?" His words were poison, but his men said nothing more. Even they knew something had shifted irrevocably. Back inside, Ronald accepted a glass of water from Maria, his hands steady as he drank. The crowd had begun to settle, though the energy lingered like heat after a fire. Some came to thank Ronda directly, shaking her hand, telling her she had done what they had wished they could do. She accepted their gratitude with humility, each word of thanks deepening the weight she felt on her shoulders. She hadn't done this for recognition. She had done it for her grandfather. But the reality was clear. This moment had already grown larger than her. "Grandpa," she said softly when they were finally alone at the table, "I didn't mean for all this." Ronald smiled faintly, his eyes creased but bright. "You meant to stand for what mattered. That's enough. The world will do what it does with the rest." By evening, the videos had spread beyond Millbrook. Regional news anchors ran the clip under bold headlines. "Champion fighter protects veteran in small-town diner." National outlets weren't far behind. In living rooms across the country, people watched a frail-looking man slapped and silenced, only to see his granddaughter explode into action, flipping the aggressor to the floor. It was irresistible television, But for Ronald, it was far more personal. Calls began to come in, old comrades from his Navy days, distant relatives, even reporters seeking comment. Maria's phone rang incessantly with journalists, begging for interviews. Tommy Carter, the journalism student who had been filming from outside, found his footage in demand by multiple networks. By midnight, the little diner in Millbrook had become the center of a national conversation. But with attention came danger. The Harpers had held influence in Millbrook for years, through business ties, intimidation, and connections that ran deeper than most people knew. Clyde's humiliation would not go unanswered. Already whispers spread in the corners of the town, whispers of retaliation, of making the Rouseys pay for turning the spotlight on what was meant to remain in the shadows. Rhonda stayed with her grandfather that night, refusing to leave him alone. They sat together in his living room, the old clock ticking on the mantel, the television screen glowing with replay after replay of what had happened. Ronald turned it off finally, shaking his head. "It's strange," he murmured, "to live so long in quiet, only to find yourself at the center of noise you never wanted." She squeezed his hand gently. "You've lived with honor. That's why it matters now. People see the truth, Grandpa." His eyes softened at her words, but behind them was the calculation of a man who had lived through battles where truth was not enough to keep you safe. He knew the game was only beginning. Outside, the town was restless. Supporters rallied online, voices rising in defense of Ronald and Rhonda. But in the dim back rooms of Millbrook, men like Clyde Harper and his allies plotted their next move. They could not afford to lose control. The development projects, the money, the influence. It all rested on keeping men like Ronald silent and outsiders like Rhonda at bay. And now the whole world was watching. The cafe, once just a place for morning coffee and quiet talk, had become a stage. The audience was no longer just Millbrook. It was America. And Ronald knew what that meant. The fight they had thought ended when Clyde fell to the floor was only the beginning of something far larger. He looked at his granddaughter as she drifted into uneasy sleep on the sofa, her head resting against the cushion, her breathing steady after the storm. He pulled a blanket over her shoulders and whispered to the empty room, "You've given me strength, Rhonda. But God help us, you've also lit a fire that won't be easily put out." The night stretched on, filled with distant headlights passing on the road, the hum of crickets outside, and the faint but growing sound of a nation's attention turning toward Millbrook. What had started with a slap in a diner had become a battle for dignity, for justice, and for the soul of a small town that could no longer hide its truths. And as dawn approached, Ronald Rousey knew there would be no going back. The dawn that crept over Millbrook the next morning was unlike any the town had seen in years. A soft mist hung low over the river, the light spilling slowly across the rooftops as though hesitant to illuminate a place now carrying the weight of a nation's gaze. Ronald Rousey stood at his kitchen window, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, his gaze fixed on the water below. His body ached faintly from the night before, the sting on his cheek a constant reminder of what had taken place in Murphy's diner. But it wasn't the pain that occupied his mind. It was the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted, that the quiet life he had carved out for himself in retirement had been shattered, and that his granddaughter's intervention had thrust both of them into the eye of a storm that would not calm easily. Behind him, Rhonda stirred on the sofa, where she had insisted on keeping watch. She sat up slowly, her hair mussed, her eyes still sharp even in the haze of morning. "You didn't sleep," she said softly, not as a question, but as a truth she already knew. Ronald smiled faintly, his reflection in the window showing lines deeper than the years could account for. "Old habits," he replied. "A man spends a lifetime waking to the smallest sound. It's hard to let go of that." She joined him at the window, standing beside him in silence for a long time. The world outside looked peaceful, but they both understood that beneath the stillness lay unease. Across town, people were already gathering in hushed groups, trading stories about what had happened, their words carried further now by screens and headlines. The video of Clyde Harper sprawled on the diner floor had been replayed millions of times overnight. Cable news anchors debated the meaning of it, talk show hosts invited guests to weigh in, and social media roared with opinions. To some, it was a story of a veteran wronged and defended with honor. To others, it was the symbol of a country divided between old power and a new generation unwilling to bow. For Ronald, it was something simpler, yet heavier. It was about dignity. By mid-morning, visitors began to arrive at his door. First were the veterans, men his age who had once worn uniforms with pride and who now came in caps and jackets adorned with faded patches. They shook his hand, some wordlessly, others with tears in their eyes. "You reminded us who we were," one whispered, his voice breaking. Another clasped Rhonda's shoulder, thanking her as though she had defended them all, not just her grandfather. Ronald accepted their gratitude with humility, but each handshake reminded him of the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He had not asked to be a symbol, yet now he was one. Later came the reporters. Their vans lined the street, their microphones thrust forward the moment he opened his door. "Mr. Rousey, do you believe this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern in Millbrook? How does it feel to have your granddaughter hailed as a national hero? Do you plan to press charges against Clyde Harper?" The questions poured in, each more insistent than the last. Rhonda stepped forward, shielding him with her presence, her voice firm as she said, "No comments right now." She guided him back inside, closing the door against the hungry world outside. Ronald sank into his armchair, staring at the carpet as though it might yield answers. "It's begun," he murmured. Rhonda knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Then we face it," she said. "The way you taught me, head on." Her confidence was steady, born of years in the cage and on the mats. But Ronald's concern was deeper. He knew battles were never only about fists. They were about influence, about hidden hands pulling strings, about endurance when the fight stretched far beyond the arena. In the days that followed, Millbrook became a place divided. Some townspeople rallied around the Rouseys, holding signs that read, "Respect our veterans and justice for Ronald." Others clung to their silence, fearful of what standing against Clyde's family and allies might cost them. A few even muttered resentment, claiming that outsiders were bringing unwanted attention, that the town's reputation was being destroyed by one viral video. But the tide had already turned. The recordings Eleanor Patterson had secretly gathered began to surface, shared with federal investigators who arrived quietly but decisively. The conspiracy to drive newcomers out, to devalue property for development, unraveled thread by thread until even the mayor could not deny it. Ronald watched it unfold not with triumph, but with solemnity. Each revelation confirmed what he had suspected, yet it pained him to see his town laid bare, its corruption exposed to the world. He thought of the Millbrook he had chosen to retire in, the place that reminded him of the America he had fought to protect, and he wondered if such innocence could ever return. Still, he held his head high. The bruise on his face healed, but the mark it left on the town would linger far longer. Rhonda stayed by his side through it all. Together they attended the town meeting where Sheriff Hayes, under the scrutiny of cameras, promised reforms and accountability. Together they stood as Clyde Harper was led away in handcuffs, his power dissolved not by violence, but by truth made undeniable. Together they listened as people from across the nation wrote letters, sent messages, and traveled long miles just to shake Ronald's hand or thank Rhonda for showing what it meant to stand up. Yet in the quiet moments, when the cameras were gone and the house fell silent, it was the conversations between grandfather and granddaughter that carried the deepest weight. One evening, Ronald sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, the river catching the last light in streaks of gold. Rhonda joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. She handed him one, and for a while they simply sipped in silence, the cicadas humming in the trees. "You changed everything, Rhonda," he said finally. "Not just for me, but for this town. Maybe even for more than that." She shook her head. "You're the one who taught me what to stand for. I just used what you gave me." He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Then maybe that's what legacy really is. Not the medals or the titles, but the lessons that carry on. You've proven that mine wasn't wasted." She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "I just didn't want them to take your dignity, Grandpa." "They couldn't," he replied softly. "Not while I have you." The words hung between them, richer than any headline, more enduring than any video clip. In that moment, Ronald understood that his legacy was secure, not in the honors of the past or the battles he had fought, but in the strength of the woman beside him. She was his continuation, his answer to a world that so often forgot what honor meant. When the sun finally slipped below the horizon, Ronald stood, his body stiff but his spirit unbowed. He looked out over the river one last time before turning to Rhonda. "Come on, Sean," he said. "Tomorrow will bring more noise. Tonight, we rest." And for the first time since the slap that had started it all, Ronald Rousey allowed himself a measure of peace. His granddaughter at his side, the truth revealed, the weight of silence lifted. The legacy was no longer his alone. It was theirs, bound together by blood, by courage, and by the unshakable belief that dignity, once defended, can never truly be taken away. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Check out the other videos on this channel right now. You won't believe what happens in them. And share this video with your friends because this is the one everyone will be talking about.